Bible, please, to the book of Ruth, chapter 2. The book of Ruth, chapter 2. Trust that you'll make your plans to be with us on Sunday evening for our training union, our evening service. We've been looking at the book of Proverbs, not chapter by chapter and verse by verse, but been looking at some key subjects in the book of Proverbs. And tonight we'll look at the matter of watch your words. Watch your words. You know, words are powerful. One man said, keep your words sweet. You might have to eat them. It's true, too. And so I trust that you'll make your plans to be with us. On Wednesday evening, of course, in our Bible study in here, we'll go into Matthew chapter 9, if you want to read that chapter for us. Our theme this year is learning to glean. Ruth is now going into a field of a stranger, to glean whatever she can get, just a meager pittance of food, but whatever she can find, she'll be there. And as she gleans, she begins to discover some truths she had never known before. And she began to find that there were relationships that she had never dreamed that she could have had. Then she's going to find out that she's going to be part of an ancestry that will save the world from sin. What a story the book of Ruth is. It's 4 chapters. It's a love story, really. And it's a love story between a woman and her mother-in-law. And it's a love story between a woman and a man, but it's a love story of Jesus for his people. And so it's an amazing book. Turn to chapter 2 and stand with us. And in chapter 2, we find Ruth in his field of grace. In his field of grace. Verse 1 of chapter 2. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. If you were to read this from a world standpoint, why, you would just simply look at it and say, well, she just happened by this field. She just happened in the field of Boaz. But from a godly point of view, God was orchestrating this really from eternity past. And he was leading in every circumstance of life, even though she didn't even know it and didn't even understand it. God puts you and I in places like that from time to time. Now verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from morning until now. Then she tarried a little in the house. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from thence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? And Boaz answered and said unto her, it hath fully been shown me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law, since the death of thine husband, and thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come into a people which thou knewest not hitherfore. The Lord reckon recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Then she said, Let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoke friendly unto thine handmaiden, though I be not like unto one of thine handmaidens. And Boaz said unto her at mealtime, Come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. So she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. And her mother-in-law saw that she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today, and where wroughtest thou? Blessed be thee that took knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is a near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto me also, that thou shalt fast by the young men until they have eaten all my harvest, or ended my harvest. And Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It is good, my daughter, that thou go out with the maidens, that they meet thee not in another field. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. Look at verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean the ears of corn after him in the sight of, if I shall find grace, and said, Go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light upon the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the kindred of Elimelech. Now let's pray together, and let's ask the Lord to speak to our heart as we look into His Word this morning. Brother Tom, lead us as we pray.
Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this blessed day that you give us. We thank you, dear God, for this church and the group, dear Lord, that's come out, dear God, to worship Thee. We ask your richest blessing on each one here. We ask, dear Lord, that you bless this word that's been read in your presence, dear God. We ask, dear Lord, that you would guide this brother that brings the meaning of these words, dear Lord, that you would open up our hearts and our minds, dear Heavenly Father, that we would accept your word, that we would take your word into our hearts and we would use it, dear Lord, that it would guide our lives and give us, dear Lord, the glory that you would have for us. Ask, dear Lord, most of all, that you forgive us for what we failed in. Thank thee for thy Son, dear God, that sacrificed his life for us. And all these things we ask for this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. You may be seated. Have you ever found yourself at wit's end? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you seem like that's it, I've gone just as far as I can go, I don't know what to do, and all I know to do is just tie a knot at the end of the rope and hang on? Well, a lot of people have found themselves at that place. Many of a Christian has found themselves at that place, just come to the end of the line. Here is a woman by the name of Naomi, left the house of God, the house of bread, and went to a Moabitess country. And she finds herself there alone. Her husband dies. All she has now is her two daughters-in-law, and things are looking bad. But one of the daughters-in-law decides that she'll come back home with her. She'll not leave her. And so they come back into the place where they should have been and where they should have stayed all alone. But she even there finds herself in a desperate situation. Think about the situation that this woman found herself in. Number one, she found herself in a male-dominated society. Women had no rights, nothing. A man could have divorced a woman easily and simply. As a matter of fact, if he found any kind of a fault in her, he could just simply go to the city gates, state his situation, and say to the woman, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, and that's it. She found herself all alone. And so, no real rights, no real prospects at all, and here she is, and she gets to the point where she says, don't call me, Naomi, pleasant, but call me Myra, which is bitter. Have you ever come to the place where you were just bitter? Life is just very difficult and very hard, and you wondered, how did I get to this place? And so just day after day you lived in bitterness. Maybe because of what someone had done to you. Maybe because of some awful mistakes that you made. And maybe you even come to the point where you felt like that God had forgotten you, that He had deserted you, and they didn't care anymore. And so here is this woman almost to the end of it all, and she finds herself in a position where she almost had no power, no strength, no leverage, no nothing, just all alone. And then, on top of that, she's poverty-stricken. Poverty is an awful thing, isn't it? I've seen poverty. I've seen it. I've visited a lot of places, and I've seen poverty. Flew into Manila, and we went over to the New Tribes guest house to spend the evening. The next morning we got up, and 2 or 3 of the preachers and missionaries was going to go to another place, and some others were going to go to another place, and I was to go down to Davao to speak. And I was going alone, and so we went over to the domestic airport. And as we were going over the domestic airport, I was just looking around at Manila. Manila is a city of 11 million people. And we were driving there, and here's this river that runs right through the middle of Manila. And there's a big sign up there, and it said, "This is the river of our dreams." And that river was filled with filth and stench. And I thought to myself, how could this be the river of anybody's dreams? And downtown Manila, the big buildings, the office buildings, and so forth and so on, but poverty all over the place. We're heading to the domestic airport, and the fellow that's driving the jeepney, he says, this is what Manila is all about. And I looked over there, thousands of people living over there, and you know what they were living in? The big crates that refrigerators come in, and stoves come in. They had taken those crates, and they had put them together, and one would be maybe a little living room, one would be a bedroom, one would be a kitchen, and they cooked outside, and so forth and so on, and had nothing, just nothing. And hundreds of these all over the place. They were living in poverty. I remember Wayne Williams came to our church, and he started visiting, and he took me visiting with him. And so we just went all over the hills of Ray County visiting. And we drove over to a portion of the county that I knew, but I hadn't gone there very much. But we drove back over there, and we came up a hill, and when we come over the top of the hill, we saw a house sitting back over there, just a rundown shack. And he said, I think there's people there. And so we drove over, stopped, and he and I got out. And we walked up. And here's the porch. Remember the old-fashioned porch? And slabs were out, slabs were broken. And I was afraid to step up on it because I was afraid I'd fall. And you could maybe break a leg or something. And here come little kids out, 4 or 5 of them. And here come a woman shabbily dressed. And I could see a man sitting in there in the living room. There's 2 teenagers, a girl and a boy. And they came out. And the boy came out, and he had a pair of old breeches, old jeans that was tattered and worn, and had a rope for a belt. He found him a rope, put that around him and tied it on him, and had on a shirt. And that was it. They were living in poverty. And Wayne said, I want to come by and pick y'all up for Sunday school. And so Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night, until these people moved, we came over and picked them up on our bus, took them to Sunday school. Only good meal they ever had when somebody at church fed them. Somebody brought something for church and for Sunday school so they could have something to eat at our church at Pleasantdale. And they were living in poverty. And this is where Ruth found herself in. Male-dominated society, living in poverty, just almost nothing. And then both her and her daughter-in-law are widows. And in those days, a widow, if they did not have a family to take care of them, if they didn't have a husband to take care of them, they were on their own. And they just had to do the best that they could. And so here they are, they're widows, and there's not a man to take care of them, not a man to show any help whatsoever. To add to the problem, Naomi is old now. Way up in years. She couldn't do anything for herself if she wanted to because she's too old. No man would probably have her now. And nobody really cared. And so there she was. And she's just old in age. Now here's Ruth, who's a young woman, but she's a foreigner. She's a Moabitess. Did you know the Jews hated the Moabites? And for a good reason. They were pagans. Child sacrifices was the norm for them. I've told you about that situation altogether. And so even though she made the decision to come back with her mother-in-law, when the people that knew Naomi saw all of that, they backed away. You ever had your friends to back away? People that you'd known all your life and you thought they loved you and they backed away and they said, I'm not having anything to do with you. And so here they are, destitute, alone. What are they going to do? Well, there's a bright side to the story. What is the bright side to the story? There's a God in heaven who loves His people. And there's a God in heaven who, in the midst of the worst circumstances, can work by His grace and turn that desolate situation into something marvelous and wonderful. I'm afraid that we that live in America really don't appreciate the grace of God. We don't. Because we've had so much given to us. We were born into a family that loved us. Mom and Dad did. My generation, the idea was Dad stayed home. He didn't divorce his wife. He loved his family. He took care of them. He took the best of care of them. He raised them up. And the idea was, I want my son and daughter to have more than I've ever had. And we were sort of raised in that kind of a culture, that kind of a society. And we fail to remember that there are people around the world that are starving to death and nobody cares. And I'm afraid in counties like Granger County and Ray County and Sevier County, where wealth and good times are had and everybody's got iPads and iPhones and televisions, and you can be 10 years old and have an iPhone, iPad. I've looked around. I'm probably going to see a little 10-year-old boy with one of these new watches on, And he'll probably know how to use it better than I will. But anyway, that's a society we live in. And I wonder if we really appreciate what God has done for us and how He's blessed us. Question: what would you do if you'd have found yourself in Ruth and Naomi's place? What would you have done if you found yourself there where Naomi was? Do you think maybe she began to regret her situation? Think maybe? No. Here is a woman that took what she had, did the best of what was given her, and used it for the glory of God. It's a story of love. God loved her, and she found the love of her life. You You see, in the most discouraging times, listen, in the most discouraging times, in the background, behind the scenes, God is at work. If we'll magnify His grace, depend upon His grace, and pray for His direction in our life. And so, here you turn to chapter 2 of the book of Ruth. Ruth doesn't sit back and wait for something to happen. Have you got that? She doesn't sit back and wait for something to happen. She gets out there and starts looking for something and looking for food and for something she can do. And so behind the scenes, God is at work. He has a plan. He has a plan of grace. The story of grace is unfolding. His plan of redemption is unfolding. Now, you read, or we read, the whole chapter. And you read the conversation. Now listen to me. You read the conversation between her and Boaz and Ruth. You read that conversation. And it doesn't seem like that conversation has anything to do with God at all, does it? Doesn't look like it has anything to do with God at all. But it's God who's the one that's working. It's God the one that's directing. It's God that brought Ruth and Boaz together. It's God who's preparing for them. Now watch. Ruth goes into the workplace. Unbeknownst to her, by the way, let me just say this. Sometimes you and I, as we go through the daily routine of life and our daily conversations, we don't really give much thought to what's really going on. But in the midst of all of it, God is at work. Are you aware of that? Are you aware of that? I might want to ask you this kind of a question. Is your life going to make any difference in history? Is your life going to make any difference for the glory of God? Is your life or mine going to make any difference in eternity? And here's just this simple woman and a simple conversation between her and another man, yet God is at work. She goes into the workplace, and as she goes into the workplace, she's really doing all she can do, but what she does, God's going to bless it. Don't sit down and feel sorry for yourself. Don't sit around and beg and hope everybody else will help you. Get out and do something. Just get out and do something. That's what she did. She knew what she could do, and she started doing it, and it's an amazing thing. When she did what she could do, God began to do what she could not do. Have you got that? God will not do for me what I can do for myself. But what I'm willing to do, what I can do for myself, He then will do for me what I can't do for myself. And that's exactly what God did. She said, I'm going to go out and find me a field and I'm going to go to work. And do you think it was a happenstance? Do you think it was just merely by chance that this happened? No. God was at work. I was listening to a sermon by Dr. Lee Robertson this week. I didn't feel good and I couldn't go into the study, and so I went in the front room and I tried to read. I sat down in my easy chair and tried to read, and I couldn't read. And so the television that we have, a little bit different than any I've ever had. You can take your little remote and you can turn YouTube on and Hulu Plus and all the rest of it. And so I turned YouTube on and I typed in Dr. Lee Robertson. And here comes a sermon up by Dr. Lee Robertson. And as he's preaching, he gives this story about how God works. Listen to this. One of his men that was a deacon in his church in Chattanooga was sent on business to Toronto, Canada. And as he was there on business in Toronto, Canada, he was walking down the street going from business to business about what he was to be doing that day. And he saw a man across the street standing in front of a bank, leaning against it with his foot up against the wall just like that, dressed in a suit. And Dr. Robertson's deacon walked up to him and said, "Sir, do you know how to get to heaven?" And the man said, "Well, I'm not really interested. I don't really care. That kind of thing don't interest me at all." And so this businessman from Chattanooga pulled out a gospel tract and said, "Sir, would you read this?" And the man said, "Well, I'll take it." 2 weeks later, in Chattanooga, this deacon is back in Chattanooga, and there's a phone call. And this man said, "Sir, you don't remember me, but I was the man standing by that bank up in Toronto, and you gave me a tract." He said, "I live in Boston." He said, "I'm a businessman. I live in Boston, and I was there on business." And he said, "I read that tract," and he said, "I want to know how to get to heaven." He said, "My wife and I are going to fly to Chattanooga, and I want to talk to you about it." He said, "I'll let you meet my pastor." The man and his wife flew to Chattanooga, met with this deacon and Dr. Robertson, and was led to the Lord there in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the man said to Dr. Robertson, said, "What is all of this around here? Well, what is all this? All these buildings, all these students?" And Dr. Robertson said, "Well, this is Tennessee Temple Schools. We have a college, a seminary, a Bible school. We have a missions program here. We have a..." And then he just explained it all to him. And the man said, "Well, sir, I see what you're doing." And he said, "God's blessed my wife and I, and we want to help you." And come to find out, this man was the owner of one of the largest insurance company in the world. I'll not name the company. You'd know his name if I mentioned it. That man, through the course of years, sent millions of dollars to Tennessee Temple Schools just to help it out in building buildings and sending missionaries to the world. Here's a deacon in Toronto, Canada, just going down the street, sees a man. That's all just chance, huh? That's just happenstance. Hands out a tract. What I'm trying to say is we never know what God's doing in the background. In the most difficult of circumstances, Ruth is letting God lead her. Now, have you noticed something else about Ruth in this situation? Ruth was known, listen, Ruth was known or became known as a giver, not a taker. You know, a lot of people go through life and they're takers. They just take. They never give. They just take. They never give. That was not the way Ruth was. Hard situation, difficult situation, but I'm going to go out here and I'm going to do the very best that I can. Don't lose hope, friend. Don't lose hope, because God is at work. Now it becomes clear what's happening. Boaz is a next of kin. He is a kinsman redeemer. And God is leading these two together, and some tremendous things are going to happen. Now, God willing, next week we'll begin to look at Ruth in his field, gleaning in his field. And there's some lessons that we need to learn about gleaning in his field. Here's what happens. Naomi did what she could do. She did what she could do. The only thing that she could do was just get out and do the best she could. Here's what she's hoping for. Just a little bit of grain. That's all she's looking for. You see, the law of the kinsman in that day required that the poor be taken care of. If you owned a field and if you planted a barley harvest or whatever the harvest was, there was called the law of the reaper. And what was that law? The law was this, that all the way around the field, you leave some grain for the poor. Leave some grain for the poor. Boaz was the owner of that field. and he left some grain for the poor. Ruth is poor, and she's out there gleaning just for a little bit of grain, just whatever she can get, so her and her mother-in-law won't starve, so they'll have something to eat. But God didn't just lead her to any field. God didn't just lead her to any field. He said, Ruth, you're going to a child of mine. And he happens to be rich. And he happens to be your next of kin. And then that next of kin says to his men, don't you touch her. You watch her, you take care of her, and then you leave for her handfuls on purpose. That's our God. That is our God. He'll lead us where we need to go. He'll put in our pathway exactly what we need and much more. He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Handfuls on purpose. Are you gleaning today in his field of grace? Or do you do what most people do? Just get up of a morning and, another day, got to go to work, got to do this, got to do that. Oh, if I can just get by today. Or do you realize that you're a part of God's plan? I can't get. There's no way I can get away from this. On a certain day in 1950, just on a certain day in 1950, on our farm down in Ray County, my mother and grandmother decide that we need some things from Harmon Denton's grocery store, which is a little over a mile away. And we take out walking over there. I remember it as if it was yesterday. And we walked over there, and I would stand and listen and watch while they bought what they needed, and they had the old-fashioned cola in the can where the water was cold. You remember all of that? And a Donald Duck drink was 5 cents. You remember that? You don't even remember a Donald Duck drink. Well, it was good. Don't do that to me. It was good. And for a 5-year-old boy looking at a Donald Duck drink, I could taste it before I pulled it out of there. Thank you. Oh, you're from Alabama. That excuses the whole thing. And I'm waiting for all of this. Okay, we get our groceries done, and we don't put them in a grocery bag. Back then, you put them in sacks. You go to Dayton and go trading and put your groceries in a sack, a grocery sack. Guy knows what I'm talking about. He's in his 80s. He understands that. And we start walking back up the hill. And we get to the top of the hill there on Concord Road, right at the top of the hill, and here comes this car. And we get over to the side of the road so the car can go by, and the car stops. And a man and a woman are sitting in the car, and the man says to my mother and grandmother, y'all need a ride? And they said, well, we would enjoy it. And so we got in the car, and he said, my name's Gian Francis. I'm pastor of Pleasantdale Baptist Church. Well, we started coming to Pleasantdale Baptist Church, and that's how I got saved. Do you think that was just a coincidence that at that particular day we had to have groceries, that we had to go to Harmon Denton's grocery store, that we got back at the top of the hill the same time? G and Francis, absolutely not. God was behind it all. And I'm going to heaven because of the marvelous grace of God. Let me put it this way. My mother and grandmother were in his field that day. They were led by God. That's the way I look at it, because that's the Bible way of looking at it. Now, do you know you're saved? Do you know you're on your way to heaven? Do you know you're in the work of God that he's called you to do? Let's stand with heads bowed and eyes closed.